There's a story about a great flood, a catastrophic deluge that covered the earth, destroyed almost everything, and left only a small group of survivors to rebuild the world. You know this story, but here's what you may not know. It exists in almost every human culture on Earth. The ancient Sumerians told it thousands of years before the Bible was written. The ancient Greeks had it. The Hindus had it. The Chinese had it. The Aztecs had it. The Lakota Sioux had it. The Aboriginal Australians had it. More than 200 versions of the flood story have been documented across independent cultures on 6 continents, many of which had no contact with each other, many of which developed their versions before written language existed. 200 versions. Same story. Different names. This is not a coincidence, and it is not explained by cultural diffusion, by one culture borrowing the story from another. The geographic spread is too wide, the time period's too deep, the isolation too complete. Something else is happening, something that tells us less about the specific events these stories describe and more about the human mind that keeps generating them. The flood story is just one example. The same pattern appears everywhere you look. Every major human culture independently developed creation myths describing how the world was made from chaos or void. Every major human culture has stories about trickster figures, beings who bend rules, cross boundaries, and reveal truth through deception. Every major human culture has hero journey narratives following a recognizable arc: departure, ordeal, transformation, return. Every major human culture has stories about a world tree or cosmic axis connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. Every major culture has figures who descend to the realm of the dead and return. Every major culture has stories about monsters that lurk at the boundaries of the known world. Every major culture has narratives about fire, its theft, its gift, the punishment of whoever gave it to humanity. These are not local stories. They are not cultural accidents. They are the recurring dreams of our species. The question of why is one of the most profound in all of human intellectual history. And the answers that scholars, psychologists, and anthropologists have proposed fall into 2 broad categories, which are not mutually exclusive. The first is that these myths reflect universal human experiences, things that happen to all humans in all places and all times, producing similar stories because they are responses to similar realities. The second is that these myths reflect the architecture of the human mind itself, that the patterns are not in the world but in the brain, and that the brain keeps generating the same stories because it is built the same way everywhere. Both of these things are probably true, and together they reveal something extraordinary about what mythology actually is. The flood story first. Geologists and historians have long noted that catastrophic flooding events were genuinely common throughout human prehistory. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, inundating coastal settlements across the globe. Many human communities lived near water, rivers, coastlines, floodplains, because water was essential to survival, which also meant they were exposed to flooding in ways that inland communities were not. A catastrophic flood was, for many early human communities, a real and recurring experience. The story may persist because the event it describes, in some form, actually happened over and over in different places to different people. But this explains only part of the pattern, because the flood story is not simply a disaster narrative. It has a specific shape. There's a warning. There's a chosen survivor. There's a vessel. There is the destruction of an old world. There is the emergence of a new one. This shape, this narrative structure, appears to be generated not just by the experience of flooding, but by something deeper, by the way the human mind processes catastrophe, survival, and renewal. The scholar Joseph Campbell spent decades cataloging what he called the monomyth, the hero's journey, a narrative pattern he identified in myths and stories from virtually every human culture. The hero receives a call to adventure. They cross a threshold into the unknown. They face trials and enemies. They reach an innermost cave or ordeal. They emerge transformed. They return with a gift for their community. Campbell argued that this pattern exists in every human culture because it reflects the universal structure of human experience, of growth, of the necessary encounter with difficulty, of transformation through suffering. Critics have noted that Campbell's framework can be applied too broadly, that it sometimes flattens real differences between mythological traditions in the interest of finding universal patterns. But the core observation, that narrative structures recur across independent cultures in ways that cannot be explained by contact alone, has been supported by decades of subsequent scholarship. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss proposed a different explanation. He argued that myths are not primarily stories about events. They are structures for thinking, binary oppositions that the human mind uses to make sense of the world. Life and death, nature and culture, male and female, raw and cooked, sacred and profane. Every myth, Lévi-Strauss argued, is fundamentally a way of mediating between opposites that cannot be resolved, of creating a narrative that holds tension without resolving it. And because the fundamental oppositions of human existence are the same everywhere, the myths that navigate them have the same underlying structure everywhere. This is why trickster figures appear in every human culture. The trickster, coyote in Native American traditions, Loki in Norse mythology, Anansi in West African tradition, Hermes in Greek mythology, is fundamentally a boundary crosser. A being who exists between categories, who moves between the divine and the mortal, between animal and human, between life and death. The trickster embodies the contradiction that cannot be resolved. He is necessary because every human culture must grapple with the fact that the categories we use to organize the world are not perfectly clean, that reality leaks through the edges of our concepts, and that the leak is where the most interesting truth lives. And then there is Carl Jung. Jung proposed that the recurring figures and patterns in world mythology, the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the self, are not cultural inventions but expressions of what he called archetypes, universal patterns in the collective unconscious that all humans share. Jung believed that beneath the personal unconscious of the individual lay a deeper layer of unconscious experience shared by all of humanity, structured by these archetypes that express themselves in dreams, in art, in ritual, and above all in mythology. The scientific status of Jung's collective unconscious remains contested. But what is not contested, what the cross-cultural mythological record makes abundantly clear, is that certain figures and patterns do appear with extraordinary regularity across independent cultures. Whether this is because they reflect shared unconscious structures, or because they reflect universal features of human experience, or because they're the most effective narrative solutions to the problems all humans face, the pattern itself is real. Consider fire. Across cultures with no contact with each other, there are myths about the theft or gift of fire. In Greek mythology, Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity, and is punished for eternity. In Native American traditions, across dozens of distinct cultures, various animals steal fire and bring it to the people. In Polynesian tradition, Maui captures fire from the underworld. The specific details vary. The structure is identical. A liminal figure, neither fully human nor fully divine, transgresses a cosmic boundary to bring something essential to humanity and pays a price for it. Why the story everywhere? Because fire is everywhere in human history, and its acquisition, its control, and its danger are universal human experiences. But also because the story of someone who transgresses boundaries for the benefit of others, who pays a personal cost for a collective good, is one of the most fundamental moral templates the human mind generates. The fire theft myth is not just a story about fire. It is a story about the cost of knowledge, the danger of transgression, and the ambiguous relationship between humans and whatever forces govern the universe. This is what myths actually are. They are not primitive science, not failed attempt by pre-scientific people to explain natural phenomena. They are not simply entertainment. They are the tools the human mind uses to think about things that cannot be thought about directly, death, and what comes after, the origin of suffering, the basis of moral obligation, the relationship between the individual and the community, the meaning of sacrifice, the nature of the divine. These are not questions that any culture can avoid. They arise from the basic conditions of human existence, from the fact that we are mortal, that we are social, that we can imagine futures and pasts that do not exist, that we are aware of our own awareness, that we suffer, and that we know we will die. Every human mind, in every culture, in every era, eventually confronts these questions. And because the questions are universal, the stories that attempt to answer them converge. The researcher Julien has taken a different approach to this question, applying phylogenetic analysis, the same statistical methods used to trace evolutionary relationships between species, to world mythology. By treating mythological motifs as heritable cultural traits that mutate slowly over time, Hui and his colleagues have been able to construct phylogenetic trees, showing how myths have evolved and spread across human populations over tens of thousands of years. His analysis suggests that some of the most widespread mythological motifs, including the polyphemus-type story about a hero outwitting a giant monster and a widespread group of hunter myths, may date back to the Paleolithic, before the migration of modern humans out of Africa. If true, this would mean that some of our oldest stories are older than agriculture, older than civilization, older than writing, stories that have been told and retold, transformed and preserved for 100,000 years or more. The stories you were told as a child, the stories that still move you, the stories that feel true even when you know they are not literally true, they are not yours. They are not your culture's. They belong to the species. They are older than any language currently spoken on Earth. They have been traveling with us since before we left Africa, mutating slowly, adapting to new environments and new questions, but always carrying the same essential cargo, the human attempt to make sense of being alive. Every culture that has ever existed has done this. Every culture has looked at the mystery of existence and tried to tell a story that makes it bearable. And the stories that emerged independently from isolated cultures on every continent, in every era, share a structure so consistent that it can only reflect something fundamental about the mind that made them. You are not just the product of your culture's myths. You are the product of the species that keeps making them. And somewhere underneath everything you believe, every story that feels true to you, every narrative that give your life shape and meaning, there are patterns that are older than civilization, tracing a path back through every human who has ever lived. That path does not end at the beginning of history. It ends at the beginning of being human. And it was always the same story.